Perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm Jacob. I work for Thinkst Labs, the Canary Gang, and I'm here in the coveted post-lunch coma slot, so everyone's going to have a nice little relax to talk about the pros and the cons. So we're going to, talk about the past, the present, and the future, and then come up with some conclusions. So those of you who don't quite get the rather obscure and kind of silly name, pros are the people who go around giving talks. They're also sometimes called the Security Vacation Club because they go and present at conferences in nice places and get some cushy travel. And then obviously the cons are places like here, all around the world. Our field is definitely getting bigger, but does bigger always mean better? And I think if we cannot measure our progress and our impact as a community, how can we hope to improve? And so that's kind of what led me to this topic. So I will say that, personally, this is kind of my first real keynote in front of a big audience, and I kind of felt like a fraud, usually like this morning's keynote, it's super impressive people that have a lot of experience on a lot of impressive things, and I wonder, why was I asked? So I spent a lot of time kind of approaching it like a researcher, figure out what other people have done, what's the state of the art in keynotes, what makes a good keynote, and I kind of figured out that they all get discussion going after the fact, even if people hated it and disagreed vehemently with what someone had to say, at least they're getting discussion going. So if you hate my talk, that's on purpose. If you love my talk, that's also on purpose, so thank you. And then they usually have some period of reflection, usually over their long and distinguished career, which I don't necessarily have, and then they look forward. So I hope to do that, but just kind of in a new way by applying a research mentality to this type of keynote approach. So we're going to start a decade ago in 2013. It starts, back at 44Con. So my boss, Haroon Mir, he gave a talk called A Talk About Talks at 44Con. I wasn't even there, so this story starts without me as a main character. And he gave a talk about talks at 44Con. And so this was the release of the Con Collector dataset. So it collected data from the community, armies of interns, volunteers, and lots of time spent gathering this kind of hidden dataset, right? We're not an academic community all the time, and so we don't have, citations and lots of papers, and so a lot of this is informal. And then it looked at trends within the industry, looking at how we have grown and what we've done as a community. Also, beyond pure just data, Haroon asked the community if cons are the best way to spread information and why there would be so many new ones and so little retention. He asked someone if they had even heard of this big talk from the last year. Some people had been there, but they didn't remember what was going on. So he kind of raised that question. He also we had this thing called Thinkscapes, which was using that data set to try to figure out exactly where the signal was in all of the exhausting kind of noise of all the InfoSec conferences. There are on an average, on a peak year, 4 conferences in InfoSec happening every day around the world. And so it's very difficult for you to attend all of those at all the time. And so they would pour over all this work, and then they released this to help gain perspective. And that was how they kind of funded their initial startup. And so now we jump forward a little bit to 2021, and now this is where I joined the story. So at that point, Thinkscapes was done, and now it's back. I resurrected it. It's now free. I think it's valuable. This is my plug for a free thing. It's available online. Basically, we review all of conferences and all of talks and all of papers, and then we pick out the ones that we think are really interesting, either new something or something where you're getting a lot of momentum. And so as part of this job, I had to keep collecting data and renewing the CC Con Collector data. Now we come to 2023. CC is dead. Now we have something called Citation. It's the same data set, just made a lot prettier. I think for a while, only one person could go to the website at any time because it wasn't multi-threaded. And so if you and someone else were interested in it, no luck. So we have a pretty decent data set of talks. A lot of these were things where maybe it was a B-sides where they have no information. The website's gone. It's a completely hidden data set. This may be the only record of that. We had a collection gap in 2020, 2021. Something happened around there. It's a little bit fuzzy, but there was a little dip. But it's an interesting data set. You're welcome to go explore it, citation.thinkst.com. Again, fully open. It's probably the biggest collection of InfoSec talks out there. You can query it programmatically, but also you can go and submit things that we're missing. You can add to it, and really you can help kind of keep the records of what's going on in the world. And so, unless we know our own history, we're kind of doomed to repeat it. So we have, talks, speakers, conferences, kind of series of them. And I think that's valuable in what we're doing, and to be ashamed to lose that and then repeat it. For this talk, I exported it to Neo4j because my SQL is not quite as great, and it's a little easier for me to be able to glimpse at this enormous data set and look at the relationships. So, I think in graphs, I can query in graphs. And so this is a tiny, tiny snippet of what that looks like in kind of the browser mode. Now, so for my Keynote research, so how I'm going to do something impressive, I started thinking, like, what questions do I have? And without that impressive background and history for myself to draw on, now I can start using this impressive data set to cheat and kind of answer those questions myself. So let's jump in. Let's look through that lens at our community and just kind of see where we stand. Just a note, for interest of time, I have kind of hidden some of the slides and some of the charts that are the same thing but more. They're going to be in the PDF, so you can get them from the archive if you're interested, but we'll just kind of move past those right now. So we start off, our industry generates a lot, right? So there's definitely some caveats here. This is a log scale chart, so just being twice as much is not twice as much, it's a lot more than that. And so we had some collection gap, both before I joined and then also after that. There were a number of smaller B-sides that were lost in the process, and I am trying to go back and add them slowly, but this is not a perfectly representative data set. I'm sure there are conferences that you'll be able to find that we don't have, in which case you can submit them. That would be wonderful. But even with that data being lost, it has to be log scale because of the amazing growth. If I put this, linearly scaled, it would just be off the chart, and you just see kind of a flat line and then it going up. So, basically, I think that you see a leveling up until about when COVID happened, and then it dropped down, and then it's coming back up. I think that, COVID did change things. There are some established conferences that took a break and maybe didn't come back. Some that haven't come back at all, some didn't survive, and then there's a lot of great new conferences out there that are flourishing and kind of finding their own niche in this world. And so I think it's interesting to see how these conferences will establish themselves in this very dynamic space over time. This is always a question we get asked, is how many people, oh, that's supposed to be hidden, sorry, okay. Basically, how many talks are recycled? How many people are giving the same talk at the same conference or a different conference and kind of traveling around the world in the full spirit of the Security Vacation Club? There have been some egregious outliers. There's one conference where they just present the same entire track, like one city and the next, like 40 times a year. So they just go and that's their full-time job, is giving the same talk over and over and over again in a different city around the world. If you kind of ignore some of those, and obviously you have to filter out talks named Keynote, because there are a lot of keynotes that might not be recycled, or TBD. I guess a lot of people kind of don't know what they're talking about until they get up on stage. You kind of see the percentage here of recycled talks. It's kind of within the realm of around 10 to 15% depending on the year, and I put some kind of bars looking forward in 2025. It's kind of hard to tell because we're seeing that increase again. Is that something new after COVID, or is that just kind of us, just kind of starting a new thing of repeating type talks as we go around the world? Another interesting thing I decided is that conferences are very incestuous. As you can see, there is a giant blob of conferences. Pretty much every speaker has spoken at more than one, or every conference has had speakers from other conferences. There are definitely kind of cliques of very, very close conferences, and then there are some that are more kind of standalone, but for the most part, there's a lot of overlap. About half of speakers that we have tracked over the whole 30 years or so we've been doing this have given a talk at more than one conference. The tightest connections are within that conference, so DEF CON, the closest connection is another edition of DEF CON, for example. Same thing with BlackHat. Maybe it was a BlackHat Europe and a BlackHat Asia, but conferences are the most close to themselves. After that, you start to see these little cliques. So besides BlackHat and DEF CON are the closest connection, therefore, in the number of connections, the number of speakers that have spoken at all of them or two of them. Then you start to see OWASP and ShmooCon, DerbyCon, Hack in the Box start to feed into that clique. And then you kind of see this, on the right here, a very small clique of people who don't really overlap very much with the DEF CON B-sides, the people who are presenting at Asian crypto conferences, Eurocrypt. There's not a huge overlap of formal cryptography work that's presented in an academic venue, and then the B-sides where you have a pink mohawk. So we are seeing these little kind of communities, and so this is essentially pulling out the most connected conferences rather than seeing the whole blob as itself. That said, there are also some conferences that are very unique. These are the kind of the top 5 conferences that don't have a lot of overlap. And so, I think some of these are either a very tightly knit community, or they're in a region that's not so easy to get to. So ZACon is a conference in South Africa. I've just flown there for the first time this year. It's not very easy to get to, and it's kind of a smaller regional conference, so they're not getting a lot of the kind of international speakers traveling in and out of there. Then you also have a conference like Virus Bulletin, which is kind of the place to present that type of work, and they kind of have won over the virus analysis, cybercrime market, and that's the place where they'll go. So they'll recycle talks, they'll have speakers presenting at the next edition, but they won't have that much connection with, say, a B-Sides or a BlackHat. So moving on from the conferences and the speakers themselves, I think it's really interesting to see the trends of our research, the waves of our research on different topics. So the next few charts kind of let us see which conferences were the leading edge, so which conferences kind of were the first venue for a new field or a subfield of research, and then which conferences kind of were the first one to go and take a bet on something. So the first conference where more than just 1 or 2 people were presenting on a topic, but really kind of took it mainstream. And so just the black border around the name of the conference is the kind of, you'll see in the future, that's kind of the first conference where we could find talks about XYZ. And then the orange blob or border is the first place where it started to gain momentum, where it went from being that one guy always yammering on about Android phones to, wow, this is a thing. We have, mobile security problems. So these are some of the topics we're going to look at. Again, some of these are, kind of hidden, but looking back over the last few years, these topics I think are kind of interesting. They're very big and buzzy now. But it's kind of, they shaped the research of the research community. So we have, AI, machine learning. I did look into LLMs specifically. We have the, industrial control, SCADA, ICS space. And then we have things that are more, kind of broad. So fuzzing, which you can apply to many different types of targets or classes. Phishing, social engineering, again, a big space. And then mobile security. So this is just looking at across all of them, kind of looking at the topics. What really surprised me is, first of all, how early mobile device hacking was a popular topic. I mean, the first one is back in the early 90s, kind of way before I even had a cell phone or really knew about cell phones or thought that cell phones had enough smarts to be hackable. And then it's also surprising how late, at least to me, ICS SCADA work kind of started reaching something. For something as impactful and, ingrained in our society, I was surprised that, we didn't see more people hacking power plants or something like that earlier. I guess, perhaps it's because these devices weren't as connected to the internet as they are now, and so maybe it was something that was a little bit, more insular and kind of air-gapped. There is a very tiny blip on the far right of LLMs. Basically, shooting up from nowhere just this year. I'm guessing it's going to keep going up because the hype is very, very real with ChatGPT and all the other LLMs. So this just kind of shows you a little glimpse and how massive mobile is compared to even some of the other trends. So moving specifically now from LLMs to just broader AI/ML, we see that kind of the mid-2000s when we first start seeing, again, and so you'll notice that BlackHat here is highlighted in black. They were the first conference that we have in our data set to start talking about machine learning as it pertains to security. And this is also one of the few trends that caught on faster with another conference series. So in this case, Security B-Sides kind of took it, after quite a few quiet decades, or almost a decade of quiet, 1 or 2 talks at a conference, and then all of a sudden, Security B-Side picks that up and starts running with it. And so it's really interesting to kind of, see that. Perhaps unsurprising to many of you who've had the joy and the delight of going to RSA, we see that RSA is rather late to the game, and kind of once there's an established commercial market. And then living out the hype cycle, 15 years later, there's a ton of talks at RSA about this new hot thing called AI machine learning, much, much later than after the research community. And we do see that quite a lot. They're not usually the first to the punch. They don't want to make a bet and make that the thing that's hyped until after, you start to see, some bigger impact things. More specifically within AI and ML, we're looking at a very exciting time because this is the year that a new trend is starting. LLMs have just really kind of broken onto the scene. This is the first year that you see conference venues talking about how LLMs, generative AI, really until GPT-3 or ChatGPT was available, these tools weren't useful enough to be able to do kind of the other work outside of just researching and staying in that field. So, BlackHat had the most talks about LLMs. I haven't highlighted anything as who's coalescing because we don't know yet. But I think this is really cool because we're kind of at that starting point of a new trend, and I'm really curious to track this over the years. Maybe in 10 years I'll be invited back and we can look back at it and say, wasn't that quaint. Skipping a few topics for time, we're going to just jump to phishing, social engineering. They had a really big peak and then a very muted recovery post-COVID. DEF CON here kind of flipped with BlackHat. DEF CON was the first conference to talk about social engineering and phishing, and then BlackHat kind of came on the scene and started making it a real thing. And you see it kind of set it on its upward trajectory. After BlackHat in about 2005 kind of has its peak, then the other conferences start saying this is an acceptable thing that can fit into what we didn't necessarily think of as computer hacking, because now we're hacking people or we're social engineering. And so you kind of see that it becomes an acceptable thing, and then it just goes, goes gangbuster. The last one, because it's the biggest topic, I did want to show mobile security. And so on all of these charts, I've had to hide some conferences that only had like one talk, because otherwise, the legend would be off the bottom of the screen. And here, even setting that threshold very high, so these are the top, however many lines that is, conferences, there are a lot of talks in this mobile security. And it's actually interesting that RSA had the mobile hype security back in 2014, and then it's come back after COVID, both in what I would say is non-technical conferences like a CISO summit, probably how to manage BYOD in your corporate infrastructure, as well as seeing the continued kind of growth in the DEF CON B-side space. So you see kind of, this thing has become ingrained, it became a thing. After COVID, it's come back, but kind of in the, 2 different tracks. So it's kind of an interesting way to see how these have spin in different directions. So we've seen a flurry of research, talks, sharing all this information. We've made connections at conferences like NoHatCon all around the world. What I wanted to know is what topics don't we see presented? Because they've been solved, we can all go home, we don't have to worry about that. Sorry to the person who that was their life's research and now they solved their problem and now they can retire. But are there any topics that we see that are not presented very much anymore because we've, done and dusted, we can move on from now? And so, basically looking at the earliest conference talks that we have in our database, these are the types of topics that I pulled out. So, basically early on, they were building libraries for encryption. Good, like rolling your own encryption is bad. Let's use real math done by real mathematicians and then have smart people implement that, and then let's use that code rather than making something up ourselves. People were way in the back in the day realizing that telnet and having clear text authentication is not good, so let's try to move towards, away from that. Viruses, malware, they were starting to kick around a little bit. And so these are some of the problems that, I was kind of, thinking were very early on, big problems. Let's see if we've solved any of them. But first, does anyone know, for example, when the first talk on crypto libraries were, or maybe hacking cell phones? Kind of guess roughly when these first talks were, and then keep that in your mind. So now you see the dates there. So, you know, a lot of these happened when I was either not yet alive or barely alive. And so I was shocked, honestly, as I said, that there were cell phones back there. So that's the Nokia 2010. That phone was released in back in 1994. It actually looks surprisingly like a cell phone. I was kind of imagining, you know, one of those old movie things that's like, you know, two-handed operation. But that actually looks, I mean, it's probably lighter and thinner than an iPhone. So now we're going to look at each one of these topics, again, eliding some in the interest of time, to see how we've done. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at these topics and then try to look for recent examples of either the problem being solved or pretending to be a problem. So let's start with crypto libraries. Hopefully we're done rolling our own crypto. We have a really safe baseline, and now we can get on, you know, from these basics of doing secure communication and move on with our lives. So here we have a solved problem, crypto problems, except for the fact that, you know, only a couple months ago, GitHub found that a lot of MTLS certificate validation in large libraries was done wrong. And so you could embed invalid certificates into a chain with a certificate one, and the code would say they're all right because one of them successfully changed back to a trusted CA. And so, unfortunately, you know, I'm going to mark this as not so great. Maybe we have more luck somewhere else. So surely by ripping, you know, everything out, you know, we should have a better place, right? So malware should be solved by now, right? Like we've had antivirus for years. Computer viruses are not a problem. You know, we can move on with our lives and try to see where we go. Unfortunately, malware continues to be a problem. And then I looked on Shodan, there's still millions of devices out there that have Telnet alive, and they are actively asking for your credentials. So I would mark that kind of as unsuccessful as well. And this trend continues. You look at cybercrime, apparently more than 3 times as much you know, money has been fraudulently exfiltrated or taken away over the last decade. So, you know, again, this one would be, you know, a sad thing. You kind of get the picture. You know, it's not doing great. So looking at, you know, mobile device security, you know, there's some new kernel exploits that use the GPU to get kernel access on Android devices. You know, with this EMF side channels where you can essentially feel the magnet or sense the magnetic field variations of a GPU doing neural network inference. Then you can actually recover the shape of that neural network, and then you can use that to target a black box attack on the neural network itself. So, you know, I don't think we've necessarily solved EMF side channels because the magnetic fields are still magnetic fields. Sadly, yes. So to leave you on a more positive note, because that hasn't been so great, I think there is an area where we haven't been slacking. We have, in large part due to people that are not us, but a few nonprofits, I think we can probably say that we have a win. And that would be session layer encryption. So the internet used to be, like only a few years ago, you know, more than half of traffic was served over plain text HTTP. By making new features kind of version locked to being served over TLS, you now have kind of pushed people by who want those features, like some of the new fetch operations that are built into JavaScript that can only operate when it's served over TLS. And then you have, you know, a company like Let's Encrypt who have taken the price of SSL certificates from big money to no money, and now you see this immense growth. And so now you're seeing this chart from Google showing on Chrome, you know, excluding Linux, which may be some kind of development work. The most part there, you know, 90+% of internet traffic is TLS. So, ding, 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 wonderful. So, thank you for joining me. Oh, this one also is supposed to be hidden. Okay, yeah, we haven't done that one either. So thanks for joining on that history. Hope you found it interesting like I did. As we wrap up, let's peek back at the conclusions from Haroon 10 years ago and see what he had to say. So he said that our industry was an important inflection point. We're kind of not as relevant. We're not able to solve the important problems of our day. and that we spend a lot of time kind of running around and being distracted by kind of whatever the current topic du jour is. So he said, researchers work on stuff that matters, attendees demand more. If you hate this talk, come and tell me about it. You know, organizers, let's give people what they need, not necessarily what they want. This kind of brought me to this aside, something from a long time ago. I was wondering if maybe we're playing the wrong game. You know, it's very fun when I was doing my low-level research to kind of get caught up in figuring out, you know, how can I use that one byte of information to be able to get something that I'm not supposed to get and then start leaking information. That's something that maybe we should be focusing more on what are the attackers doing, right? The attackers are playing the people, and then maybe the chess players, which are some of the folks, you know, who are very technical, are playing the game, not necessarily the player. And so if we don't know, if we're not playing the same game, maybe we'll not be successful. And then just to be meta, here's a screenshot of Haroon with a screenshot of my blog presenting at BlackHat, and then I'm sure he'll screenshot this again in the future. So let's take a look now at what our conclusions are. I think a lot of these hold up, but I think we're starting to level off. So the inflection point may have already happened. We're starting to saturate the market. We're seeing a leveling off of the number of cons, speakers, and talks. If you look at, for example, the DEF CON attendee numbers, they've actually dipped slightly after, you know, they obviously with COVID, but even past that, they haven't ever recovered to their peak of pre-COVID. And so, you know, we might not be so much as an inflection point, but a transition point, moving from, you know, something that's, you know, kind of up and coming and new to something that's well established, and now we need to keep our relevancy going forward. I think the other points are still, you know, very important. So, you know, kind of sad that for the most part, the conclusions from 10 years ago are still, you know, are still valid. Kind of sad. But I think that partly we're not seeing the whole picture. And this is an area of hope for me. So, you know, I have an intuition that we're making more progress than we think, right? I think it would be a lot harder necessarily to get remote code execution on a browser than it was 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. But I think we kind of see only either the positive result in terms of, you know, someone is able to compromise something. We don't see the thing where someone tried to hack something and were unsuccessful. And I've seen this kind of play out in other fields. So at Hawaii CSS, there was a conference, the keynote there, Jevin West gave a talk about kind of the biases in conference selection and how that can influence people's perception. So this was about some kind of antidepressant study and which ones seemed to be the most promising and then which ones were less promising. And so if you look at the top right, you can see essentially that, you know, it's a pretty promising result. All of these antidepressant trials have shown that that is a pretty good result. There's only, you know, maybe 3 things where it said it didn't work for us or something like that. And so if you take a look just above the waterline, you know, the tip of the iceberg, you're thinking, oh, those are pretty good. He was able to get some information from the FDA where drug companies have to be able to register every experiment that they run. There, you can see that there's a lot of things that they didn't submit to conferences because the results were not so positive. They didn't get a win, and so they just didn't submit. Or they were not accepted at a conference because it's kind of lame to say, we did this thing and it didn't work. So he called for conferences to more accept what they call a pre-registration model, where you say, this is the type of work I want to do, this is the experiment that I want to do, and that's what you submit to a conference, and then you're accepted on the basis of that experiment. And then at that point, you don't have the kind of, you know, self-selection bias where even if you're a negative result, you can still go and present, hey, I did this. And actually, I found a few of them, the talks on failure. Eugene Kim goes by Space Raccoon, spoke at ShmooCon about why he was a team leader for a CTF team, that's kind of their own pwn to own in China, why he and his team, despite walking in the door with O'Day on the target, which was a Synology device, none of the teams were able to walk away with any money for that target. And so he kind of stepped through kind of the robust sandboxing architecture and improvements that the Synology people had put into essentially a consumer device. This is not some formally verified military grade thing. This is something you can buy on Amazon. And I thought it was a really nice way to see that, hey, we are making progress, because you can walk in the door thinking you're really confident and then not be able to overpass good engineering. So maybe if we see more talks like this, the data will start to give us a better view. So I'm more optimistic than the data may see, because I think it would balance out the parade of bugs and fails. I mean, every year you're going to see, thank you, you're going to see something falling, but I think it's nice to also see where sometimes we're successful. So to wrap up, I think we should recognize that there is a lot of value in conferences, but it may not necessarily be the conference data that we're seeing. I think that they are a great way to collaborate and make connections between researchers. They're a way you can kind of go and sit in your laptop in the back, do a CTF together, start to learn, start to grow, and make those connections. And I think conferences like NoHat, where you are physically required to go and touch each other's dongles to be able to get points, I think that's a great model, right, where you're forcing that connection and you're trying to make the community stronger. I think also we need to do a better job of collecting the representation of the work that we do. I think citation is a great start, but it still is lacking in a lot of ways. And I think right now it's impossible for us to fully collect kind of that full view of the data we're collecting, because there are those biases. You don't want to go and present at BlackHat how you tried to hack a thing and failed and aren't you bad. And I think also, thinking about how do we disseminate information if that's our goal? How do we get that information from the research community into the engineering teams that are building the products that are surrounding us these days? I think regional conferences are the kind of ideal fit. They help make connections with people who you might be able to see and interact with on a more regular basis. They're less impactful on the environment. Echoing what our morning keynote said, is this talk is reasonably interesting, but it's definitely not, the biggest problems we're facing. If you're all here and you're able to take a train or a bus to get here, that's a lot better than, all flying to Vegas and then drinking a lot of water in the desert when it's 40 degrees Celsius. And I think also regional conferences can start to elevate, new talent, and then repeat speakers I think should be okay. Like, you can have them come back, they can continue to share, they can continue to attract new talent. So that's kind of where I kind of see as the bright star there. I think also we've seen, so in addition to just pure conference talks, for Thinkscapes, I also collect thousands of blog posts every quarter, and I review those. And it's really interesting to see, I mean, obviously during COVID, there were a lot of people who were posting blogs because there weren't conferences to go to. But even quarter by quarter, I start to see kind of this back and forth, where if it's not a conference-heavy quarter, people may have submitted to a conference and they're waiting. You see some work kind of presented ad hoc, but not a lot of stuff at conferences. And then kind of, you see the hacker summer camp. There's tons of talks out at BlackHat and DEF CON and there, and you see a lot less blogs because, the media is obsessed with whoever's hacking the latest thing at BlackHat. And so those are a great way to be able to disseminate information. And I think also they provide a searchable summary. You can start to build references, and you can start to see, I think we do a great job now of linking to code. Most every slide deck has a QR code for a GitLab code. You can go and check it out, and you can start to kind of build directly off that. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck, repeating what you've already done. So I think Thinkscapes is important because it helps people kind of get a bird's eye view of the community. I also want to make another shameless plug again for a free thing, which is called Knowledge Hub. It's basically a social paper review and sharing site. So it's on the ActivityPub thing where you can follow other researchers who are reviewing talks or conferences, and then you can kind of go and, what does someone that I respect a lot have to say about this new work? And then you can kind of get that information. And I think that's a way, again, where we can take this enormous volume of information and start to distill it down. I guess the last thing I think is really important is that we have, when I was at DARPA, there was a program there where essentially they had reached this point in another field. This was cancer research. They had so many papers being published by the community all around the world that no one, even if that was their full-time job, was to read all the papers in this very tiny field. They would never be able to get through all of them, let alone also do their own research and their own clinical studies. And so the DARPA program was asking ourselves, can we go and build automatic readers that can go and build essentially a model of all the knowledge we have for this very specific thing? And the outcome of that program, again, during its kind of experimentation phase, was promising. They were actually able to find new knowledge that someone had already discovered, but they hadn't plugged 2 and 2 together. And so we actually learned something about how these proteins operate during some kind of cancerous operation that, unless we had been sitting there and drawing those dots together, we never would have gotten, because you can't go to all the medical conferences, you can't go to all the InfoSec conferences, you can't read all the papers. And so for that, I will close, say thank you very much for your time. Are there any questions?